Our next speaker is going to be Professor Robert Edgar from Howard University, our own Department of African Studies. The title of his paper is Howard University in South Africa, Jan Smuts and African American Leadership in 1930.
I don't have copies for everybody, but here's some more. Okay, just maybe pass out a couple on each row. Well, thank you, Krista. I'm very pleased to be able to address this audience this evening. Probably one of the things that I'm best known for is my work on Ralph Bunche and his visit to South Africa in 1937. And because we have two key scholars on Bunche on the panel, I decided to look at another topic entirely. But before I get into my remarks, I just wanted to mention that when I picked up the paper this morning, I saw an obituary for Bill Greaves. Bill died just a few days ago at age 87. He was a fantastic documentary filmmaker, and of course one of his great films was his portrait of Ralph Bunche that some of us advised on. And so we want to pay tribute to Bill for all his contributions to documentary filmmaking, and especially his work on Bunche. Secondly, the paper that I'm delivering today is co-authored Dr. Myra Hauser, who graduated from the history department this past spring, who's now teaching in Arkansas. People do get jobs. She's been co-authoring this piece with me. Now, I'm going to focus my remarks on Jan Smuts and a visit he made to the Howard campus, indeed to the Carnegie building. It was the Moreland Room was there in 1930, but he came for a one-day conference on race in the United States. Now, this may seem very odd for a person, Jan Smuts, to come to Howard at that point, and I'd like to talk about the story about how he was invited and the furor that was created by his visit. But first of all, I'd like to note the context for Howard's relationship with South Africa. Because over the past century, there have been any number of South African visitors to our campus and to relationships between Howard faculty and South Africans. For instance, Alain Locke, when he was a student at Oxford University, was very close friends with Pixley Seme, who became a founder of the African National Congress in 1912. So if you go into the Locke papers, you'll see a number of letters between the two in the decades after they were students at Oxford. But over the years, people like D.D.T. Chivago, Z.K. Matthews, I use Z to South African, Z, Albert Lutuli, who was taken around campus by Professor Hansberry in the late 1940s, Oliver Tambo, Nelson Mandela, Chris Hani, Cyril Ramaphosa, Thabo Mbeki. All of these have come to the Howard campus at one time or the other. But then you get this odd man out, Jan Smuts. And he comes to Howard in 1930, and you want to ask the question, well, what was that all about? How was that arranged? And what was his reception here? So first of all, just a few comments about who Jan Smuts was. Jan Smuts was an Afrikaner, born in 1870. He was educated with a law degree at Cambridge University in England. During the 1890s, he was the Attorney General for the Transvaal Republic, one of the Afrikaner republics that was resisting the British. And during the Anglo-Boer War between 1899 and 1902, he was a very prominent leader of the resistance, became a very adept guerrilla leader. But then in the decades after that, he becomes one of the people who begins to preach unity and harmony between the Afrikaners and the English in South Africa. After 1910, he becomes in essence, the Deputy Prime Minister. But in 1919, His party is elected to power. Actually, Prime Minister Botha dies and he becomes the Prime Minister until 1924, when his party loses in an election. Now, what makes him so prominent in the period around the First World War up to 1930 is that he becomes an international statesman. He becomes very close to the leadership in Britain, and in the period right after the First World War, he's very prominent at the Versailles Peace Conference, and he becomes one of the key advocates of a League of Nations. And so in late 1929, early 1930, he's invited to the United States to celebrate 10 years of the League of Nations. And so that was the primary reason for his visit. And he's lionized wherever he goes in the United States, mostly on the East Coast. He's given honorary degrees at Columbia and Johns Hopkins. He's welcomed at the White House, where he knew President Hoover from their work at Versailles. He's given a reception at both the House and the Senate, where both of them go into recess so they can praise him for his international work. And so everywhere he was going, Jan Smuts was being lionized, treated royally. But there was an exception. And that exception took place on January 9th in New York City, where Jan Smuts addressed the town hall. There's a large audience, and he gives a speech, and there's a question and answer period, and someone asks him about U.S. race relations, and Jan Smuts called on black Americans to demonstrate patience with his own South African segregationist laws. And he says the following, and I'm quoting from him. He says, Negroes, referring to black South Africans, were the most patient of animals next to the ass. So you see that flyer that was passed out in protest. And he questioned, well, why can't African Americans be of the same kind, of the same behavioral mode? We can imagine the furor that stopped. Dr. Robert Bozeman, who was the president of Tuskegee at the time, happened to be in the audience. And he's a fairly moderate person, and even he was offended by Smuts' remarks, and he stood up and told Smuts that his remarks had wounded black people everywhere. But that didn't stop Bunch. Later that same day, on January 9th, he's addressing the Foreign Policy Association. And he refers to, quote, the Negroes of Africa as child peoples. They are happy, he said, and do not feel the burden of life like the white man. Neither do they brood over their grievances. Now, again, there's this outcry against what Smuts is saying. W.E.B. Du Bois challenges Smuts to a debate, which of course Smuts turns down. William Pickens, who's a representative of the NAACP, has this to say about Smuts. He said Smuts sounded like a representative from some travel agency bidding for American tourists. And he went on to compare him to some American politicians from the South, and he said Smuts sounded about as logical and impressive as the average politician from Mississippi would be if he were talking to an audience in Harlem on the political and social privileges of American Negroes. He went on to say, when General Smuts speaks on the League of Nations or some other non-provincial question, his logic is sound and his language lucid. But on such general topics, he is a man of the world, while on the topic of the Negro, he is a man of South Africa. While General Smuts represents the best that is in the South African system, his social mind shows very plainly that no man can rise above the system in which he was born and nurtured and in which he continues to live. He may rise to the top of his system, he can't get above it. And so you had this furor, this controversy that was raging as Jan Smuts came to Howard University on January 15, 1930. Now, what was that about? Why was he invited to Howard on that particular day? Well, the conference that was organized, and it was basically 25 people, about 20 were some of the top black intellectuals in the country, and there were 5 whites, 3 of whom were with Smuts, and several who were involved with philanthropic organizations. But the conference here at Howard was organized by the Phelps-Stokes Fund, which was the leading philanthropic group of the time, which had a lot of interest and involvement in black colleges during that era. Why did they invite Jan Smuts? Well, first of all, he had become an international figure, but it was also because the Phelps-Stokes Fund, as well as other philanthropic organizations, believed that Smuts was somebody who, if he was properly educated, might preach a policy of tolerance and the sort of lessening of racial segregation in South Africa. Now, it's interesting when you look at the Phelps-Stokes Fund during that time period, they did have an involvement in both South Africa and the United States. And in both cases, they were promoting the interracial cooperation. And so that became one of their major issues. And so in South Africa, they were promoting joint councils, for instance, between blacks and whites to promote dialogue between the two. In the United States, they were promoting interracial commissions and councils in the American South. And so the belief was that by allowing Smuts to be exposed to top black intellectuals in the United States, that some of that might rub off on him. Now, what's interesting about the conference was that Phelps-Stokes, Anson Phelps-Stokes, the head of the fund, worked out the conference with Howard's president, Mordecai Johnson. Now, by and large, I give a lot of space to Mordecai Johnson because Mordecai Johnson, when he was president, protected a lot of black faculty at Howard. Their radical ideas didn't resonate well with Congress, and Johnson went out of his way to protect you. But in this particular case, Johnson agreed that the conference would be limited to the 25 people who were selected to come to the conference. No students, and only a few Howard faculty, Kelly Miller, for instance, and Alain Locke, were invited, and that was because they were making presentations. That caused an uproar in the black press, as you might anticipate, because they saw this as a moment when Howard University really was silencing people who might be overly critical of Jan Smuts. And so no black reporters were allowed into the meeting. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of what happened in that session. Alain Locke, by the way, wrote a very long article several months later in Opportunity, which detailed what the presentations and Smuts' response during the one-day exchange. But I can say that the conference did spawn a tremendous amount of commentary from black figures after the conference. 2 of them who participated in the meeting, Kelly Miller and Alain Locke, wrote essays in which they were critical of Smuts, but then they went on to say, and I think this is because of the influence of the foundation, that give Smuts a chance. When he goes back to South Africa, let's see how things play out. But we also had a number of people who were highly critical of Smuts before and after the conference. And so the flyer that I passed around was from a monster meeting that a group called the Native African Union of America, founded in 1928, organized in New York City. Its president was a South African, Eli Nyongolo, who came to the United States in the late 1920s through the auspices of the AME to attend Wilberforce College in Ohio. And we also had a number of other commentators who criticized Smuts. Let me finish with just two remarks. The first is, as we sketched out this paper, Dr. Hauser and myself, we've looked at subsequent discussions and debates about South Africa, especially in the African American community. And time again, this meeting of Jan Smuts at Howard, and of course the comments he made in New York City, are brought up by people as really an indication of Jan Smuts' true views, and I think they were right in this. When he got back to South Africa, he really didn't succumb to any form of liberalism at all. Secondly, and by the way, Rayford Logan, some of his columns in the 1940s about Smuts are very hard-hitting. Secondly, I just wanted to go back to the issue that we've been talking about, the Howard School, and some of the issues that I think we should be thinking about as we develop this particular theme. One is the importance of philanthropic organizations with Howard University and black colleges generally. And we see this with Ralph Bunche and the involvement of philanthropic organizations wherever he went to get fellowships in terms of steering him in certain directions. And so that's something to always keep in mind, but they played a very heavy hand in the Smuts Conference. Secondly, Howard University faculty were not of the same voice all the time. They oftentimes had very strong personal as well as ideological differences amongst each other. And so there's a constant debate going on. The third thing that I'd like to focus on, and I'll finish on this comment, is that when we look at Howard University and its faculty during this time period, and students as well, they were very engaged with the outside world. So there was this constant interplay going on between what they were doing on campus and what they were doing with very practical politics outside. And I think that's very important in terms of informing the kind of perspectives they had on not only the United States, but international issues. So let me stop on that point. Thank you very much.